Please enjoy this presentation of Sherlock's Apprentice, Part 1, a new tale inspired by the world of Sherlock Holmes by A.C. MacMillan, presented in audiobook form for a traditional storytelling experience. For a more tranquil escape, this story is also available as a sleep story on our channel, designed to guide you into a peaceful sleep. Both versions are ready for you to explore. Thank you for listening, and be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more. I stood by the window of my office, the morning light slicing through the blinds and casting long shadows across the room. In my hand was the day's edition of the Chicago Chronicle, its cheap newsprint smudging against my fingers. I wasn't interested in the front page drivel. My attention was on a small column buried a few pages in, penned by T.S. Combs, the city's resident muckraker. The new kid in town, Max Mason, Private Eye. The title had a ring to it, but I wasn't sure if it was the kind that made you feel important or the kind that made you a target. I read the article slowly, letting each word sink in. Chicago has seen its fair share of characters, but none quite like the latest addition to our city's colourful tapestry. Max Mason, a hometown boy with an unlikely past, has returned to the Windy City after a lengthy apprenticeship under the late and legendary Sherlock Holmes. Not often that a young man from this city has the chance to learn from the greatest detective of our time. That line gave me pause. Holmes would have had a laugh at that, maybe even a smirk if he was feeling generous. And now Mason has opened his own private detective agency, right here in the heart of Chicago. The question on everyone's mind, can this local boy, with his mix of old-world English refinement and American grit, solve the mysteries lurking in our city's shadows? Or will the Windy City prove too much for even Holmes's protégé? Only time will tell, but one thing's for sure. Max Mason is a name you'll want to keep an eye on. I set the paper down on the desk, the ink leaving faint prints on the wood. The memories of Baker Street floated in like the smell of old books, rich, layered, a little dusty. Holmes, with his sharp eyes and sharper mind, had seen something in me, something worth honing. I wasn't sure if I'd ever live up to that, but here I was, standing in a rented office in a city that thrived on grit and gumption, trying to make a name for myself. The sound of a knock at the door pulled me out of my thoughts. The knock echoed through the room again, bringing me back to the present. I ran a hand through my hair and made my way to the door. I didn't need to check who it was. The light, rapid rhythm of the knock had become familiar over the past few weeks. I opened the door to find Mrs. Eleanor Watkins standing there, a grin already tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Well, look who's up and about at this early hour," she chimed, pushing past me before I could even offer a word of greeting. She carried a small basket, the scent of fresh-baked bread wafting from it. "I thought you might need a bit of sustenance on your first official day. Can't have you wasting away before you even start solving cases." "Mrs. Watkins, you're spoiling me," I said, closing the door behind her. She always brought an energy into the room that I couldn't quite resist. "You know I'm perfectly capable of feeding myself." "Oh, I'm sure you are, dear," she replied, setting the basket down on the desk and giving the room a quick once-over, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "But a man can't live on coffee and cigarettes alone, even if he is a detective. Besides, it's the least I can do, considering the excitement you've brought to this old building. The papers can't stop talking about you." She picked up the Chronicle and gave it a quick scan, her smile fading slightly as she looked up at me with a curious gleam in her eye. "So Max, tell me, what was it really like, working with the great Sherlock Holmes? The paper makes it sound all very glamorous, but I bet there's more to it than they let on." She settled into the chair by the window, her expression one of genuine interest. "You know, I've lived in this city my whole life, but I can't imagine what it must have been like to learn from someone like him." I watched as Mrs. Watkins made herself comfortable in the chair by the window, her eyes twinkling with curiosity. It was clear that the mention of Holmes had struck a chord with her. I'd seen that look before. the one people got when they realized I wasn't just another gumshoe. But there was something more to it with Ellie. She wasn't just curious, she was invested. "You read the Chronicles, Mrs. Watkins?" I asked, leaning back against the desk, arms crossed. I couldn't help but smile at the thought of her poring over the cases. "Oh, don't play coy with me, Max," she said, waving a hand dismissively. "I've read every one of Dr. Watson's accounts, can practically recite them by heart. The way he wrote about Holmes, it was like stepping into the middle of the action. And now, here you are, a flesh and blood connection to all those adventures. I've got half a mind to ask you if half of what Watson wrote was true." I chuckled, shaking my head. Watson had a flair for the dramatic, that's for sure, but most of it was true, or at least close enough. Holmes was something else. Brilliant, but not always easy to be around. It was like living with a hurricane. Unpredictable, sometimes overwhelming, but always impressive. Ellie nodded thoughtfully, her gaze distant as if she was picturing those old London streets and the infamous detective himself. "I can imagine. Must have been quite an experience for a young man like you, learning from someone like him. You've seen more before 30 than most men see in a lifetime." She paused, then leaned forward slightly, her tone softening. "But I suspect it wasn't all smooth sailing. Watson hinted at it, you know, the weight that comes with that kind of work. You can tell me, Max, what was it really like?" The question hung in the air between us, and for a moment I considered brushing it off. But there was something about Ellie's earnestness that made me want to give her a glimpse behind the curtain. "You're right, Mrs. Watkins. It wasn't always easy. Holmes had a way of seeing the world that, well, it changes you. Makes you see things differently too. Sometimes it was exciting, and other times it felt like a burden, knowing things, seeing patterns that most people wouldn't. It makes it hard to just live, you know?" Ellie's eyes softened, and she reached out to pat my hand. "Well, you're here now, Max, and this city's got its own share of mysteries that need solving. Maybe it's not London, but Chicago has its charms, and who knows? Maybe you'll find a way to strike a balance, solving the cases without letting them consume you." She paused, looking at me with a glint of mischief in her eyes. "Can you really do it, Max?" "Do what?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. "Can you see things like he did? Can you tell me anything about myself just by deduction?" I couldn't help but smile at her curiosity. Ellie had the look of someone who wanted to believe in a little bit of magic, even if she knew it was just skill and observation. I leaned back, giving her a once-over as if seeing her for the first time. "All right, Mrs. Watkins," I said, my tone turning serious, though the corners of my mouth betrayed a hint of playfulness. "Let's see what we can deduce." I let my gaze travel from her worn but carefully polished shoes to the slight smudge of flour on her sleeve, then up to her neatly styled hair, noticing the little details that most would overlook. "You were up early this morning," I began, "which isn't unusual for you, but today was different. I know you've been baking, but you were in a rush. That smudge of flour on your sleeve is from wiping your hands in a hurry, because you are normally quite immaculate, and the slight fray on your left shoe suggests you've been wearing them often, perhaps to the market. You take pride in your appearance, but you're practical about it." Ellie's eyes widened, but I wasn't finished. "You're wearing a brooch that's slightly older than your other jewelry, and you keep touching it absent-mindedly. It was a gift from someone important, probably your late husband, and you wear it when you're feeling nostalgic or in need of a little comfort." She glanced down at the brooch, her hand brushing over it as if she hadn't realized she'd been touching it. "My Charles gave it to me on our 10th anniversary," she murmured, a soft smile playing on her lips. "Go on, Max." I nodded, continuing. "You're curious by nature, but not nosy. You genuinely care about the people around you, which is why you've taken an interest in me. And you've been thinking about something, maybe something from your past, that you haven't quite let go of. That's why you asked me if I could see things like Holmes did. You wanted to know if I could see what you're holding back, maybe even help you with it." Ellie's expression shifted slightly, her playful demeanor giving way to something deeper, more contemplative. She looked away for a moment, as if considering how much to reveal. "You're good, Max," she said softly, meeting my eyes again. "Better than I expected. You're right. There is something I've been holding on to. But maybe that's a story for another time." I didn't press her, knowing better than to push someone who wasn't ready to talk. Instead, I nodded, letting the silence settle comfortably between us. Ellie was a sharp woman, and she'd share her story when she was good and ready. In the meantime, it was enough to know that she trusted me, maybe even enough to let me help when the time came. "Well, whenever you're ready, Mrs. Watkins," I said, offering a small smile. "I'll be here." She returned the smile, her eyes twinkling with that familiar mischief once more. "And I'll keep an eye on you too, Max. After all, someone's got to make sure you don't get too full of yourself with all these deductions." We both laughed, the tension from before easing into something warmer, something that felt a little like friendship. Just as I started to relax, another knock came at the door, sharp and insistent. Ellie raised an eyebrow, a knowing smile tugging at her lips. "Sounds like your first case might be calling, Max," she said, standing up from the chair. "Better not keep them waiting." With a nod, I turned toward the door, ready to see what the Windy City had in store for me next. Just as I reached for the door, Ellie, ever the gracious hostess, stepped forward and placed a hand on my arm. "Allow me, Max," she said with a knowing smile. Before I could protest, she had already opened the door, her demeanor shifting seamlessly from inquisitive neighbor to welcoming guardian. "Well, hello there." Ellie greeted the boy with a warmth that caught him off guard. He took a hesitant step back, clearly not expecting to find someone like her on the other side of the door. "Are you here to see Mr. Mason?" she asked, her voice as sweet as the baked goods she always seemed to have on hand. The kid, no more than 14 if that, looked past her and locked eyes with me. He was a scrawny thing, with messy light brown hair that looked like he cut himself, and a sharpness in his gaze that belied his age. His clothes hung loosely on his frame. A threadbare jacket several sizes too big, patched trousers, and shoes that had seen better days. The kind of kid you'd find running messages or picking pockets in the back alleys of Chicago. "Yeah, I need to talk to him," he muttered, his tone defensive, like he wasn't used to asking for help, especially not from someone like me. Ellie stepped aside, motioning for him to come in. "Well, don't just stand there, dear. Come in, come in. We were just finishing up anyway." The boy shuffled in, his eyes darting around the room, taking everything in at once. He had the look of a street kid, worn shoes, a jacket 2 sizes too big, and a face that had seen more than it should at his age. His gaze lingered on the shadows in the corners, the worn leather of my chair, the small but sturdy full desk that dominated the room. He was sizing up the place, calculating whether it was safe, whether I was safe. "Max Mason?" he asked, more certain this time. "That's me," I replied, leaning back against the desk, giving him a once-over. Ellie, ever the observant one, stood quietly to the side, her eyes shifting between the boy and me with interest. "Name's not important," he said quickly, cutting to the chase. "I hear you help people, solve problems." I exchanged a glance with Ellie, who raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "That's the idea," I said, keeping my tone even. "What kind of problem are we talking about?" He hesitated, glancing at Ellie as if deciding whether or not he could trust her. She must have sensed his reluctance because she gave him a reassuring nod. "You're in good hands with Mr. Mason," she said, her voice gentle but firm. The boy took a breath, then stepped forward, lowering his voice. "My friend's gone missing, one of the kids from the street, so no one else is going to care. But I think something bad's happened. I don't got money to pay you, but..." I cut him off with a wave of my hand. "We'll worry about that later, kid. Right now, tell me everything you know about this missing friend of yours." He blinked, clearly not expecting that. He nodded quickly, trying to hide the relief in his eyes. "Thanks, mister. My friend, his name's Joey. Only been gone since yesterday. Him and me was down by the old rail yard. He seen something and told me to hide, so I went to the spot we go to when there's trouble, but he never showed up, and he never came back last night, or this morning. He ain't the type to just take off. Ellie smiled softly, her eyes warm with approval. Well, I'll leave you two to it then. Max, I'm sure you'll take good care of him. Count on it, Mrs. Watkins, I said, giving her a grateful nod. She patted the boy on the shoulder before making her way to the door, leaving us to the business at hand. I watched the door click shut behind Mrs. Watkins, the room settling into a quieter kind of tension. The kid stood there, shifting his weight from foot to foot, clearly not used to being inside a place like this, or maybe any place at all. He kept glancing around, like he was still figuring out whether he was safe. I pushed the basket of fresh-baked bread across the desk toward him. Here, I said, my voice casual. You look like you could use something to eat. The kid hesitated for just a second, then grabbed the loaf with both hands, tearing off a chunk like he hadn't eaten in days. He chewed quickly, barely pausing to catch his breath. I leaned back against the desk, letting him get a few bites in before I spoke again. As I watched him devour the bread, a memory surfaced. Holmes, sitting in his armchair by the fire, speaking in that calm, measured way of his. You see, Max, Holmes had said, the value of information cannot be overstated. The city's underbelly, those places where men of standing dare not tread, hold secrets that even the most observant eye might miss. But a child, a street urchin, they go unnoticed, and therein lies their power. I had listened intently, still green, still learning. Holmes had leaned forward, his eyes sharp and clear. The irregulars, as Watson so fondly dubbed them, are not merely informants. They are my eyes and ears in places I cannot reach. And when they bring me information, I treat it as gold, no matter how small the detail. I blinked, the memory fading as I refocused on the boy in front of me. He might not have realized it yet, but he had just become my first irregular in this city, a source of information in a world where details could mean the difference between life and death. All right, I began, keeping my tone easy. You were saying your friend Joey disappeared near the rail yard. The boy nodded, swallowing hard before answering. Yeah, that's right. We all stick together, you know. Look out for each other. Joey wouldn't just up and leave without telling us. Something ain't right, mister. I nodded, watching him carefully. You're smart to come to me, I said, leaning in a little. The rail yard's not a place for kids. Plenty of ways to get into trouble there, and not all of it's the kind you can walk away from. He looked down at his hands, still clutching the bread. That's what I'm afraid of. Joey, he wasn't scared of much, but he knew better than to mess around down there too long. If he didn't come back, it's 'cause something's keeping him away. Something bad. I nodded again, more to myself this time. All right, I said. We can't just head straight to the rail yard. I'm sure they won't appreciate us walking in and poking around without good reason. I want you to go out and check all the places he might be hiding. Look everywhere he might have gone, even if it seems unlikely. If you still don't find him, come back here an hour before sundown, and we'll head to the yard together. Tommy nodded, his expression serious as he finished the last bite of bread and stood up, ready to head out. Hours passed, the day wearing on with a tense, waiting silence. I used the time to prepare, running through possible scenarios in my mind, trying to anticipate what we might find. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the floor as the clock ticked steadily on. Just as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, a knock sounded at the door. I opened it to find Tommy standing there, his face tight with worry. I've checked everywhere, Mr. Mason, he said, his voice strained. Joey's still not back. I stood up, grabbing my coat and hat from the rack. Well then, I guess you'll need to take me to this rail yard. We'll start there, see if we can't figure out what happened to your friend. The kid's eyes widened slightly, surprised at how quickly things were moving, but he nodded all the same, shoving the last bit of bread into his mouth. I could see the relief in his eyes and maybe a glimmer of hope. Thanks, thanks, Mr. Mason. Just Max, I said, giving him a small smile. And don't thank me yet, kid. We've got a long way to go before we figure out what happened to Joey. As we stepped out into the streets of Chicago, I could feel the city's pulse. A constant, rhythmic beat that hadn't changed. Even after all these years, the city was a living, breathing thing, full of grit and grime, and it still clung to me like an old coat I'd long since outgrown. The buildings loomed tall, casting long shadows over the cobblestone streets, where vendors hawked their wares and children darted between pedestrians, their laughter mingling with the sharp calls of newsboys shouting the day's headlines. But it wasn't the same city I'd left behind. In the decades since I'd been gone, the streets had changed. The old brick tenements were now dwarfed by steel and glass, the skyline pushing ever upwards as if reaching for the heavens. The air was thick with the scent of industry, smoke and oil mingling with the stale smell of the river. It was familiar, yet foreign, like a photograph that had faded over time, the edges worn and the details blurred. The kid walked beside me, his pace quick and assured, but there was a tension in his step, a wariness that came from living too long on the edge. I studied him for a moment, watching how his eyes flicked from one passerby to the next, never resting in one place for too long. He was a kid who knew how to stay invisible, but there was something more to him, something that reminded me of my own youth on these very streets. "Have I earned your name yet, kid?" I asked, keeping my tone light, though there was a weight behind the words. He glanced up at me, caught off guard by the question. "Yea, you've earned it," he replied, a touch of nervousness in his voice. "Tommy Flynn." I nodded, satisfied with his answer. "Good, Tommy Flynn it is. How'd you know to come find me?" He shrugged, though the corners of his mouth twitched upward. "I'm a newsie. Gotta know what's in the papers to sell 'em better. Read about you this morning. Figured if anyone could help, it'd be you." "A newsie, huh?" I mused, a smile tugging at my lips. "That's a tough gig. Means you've got to be sharp, stay one step ahead. You can read then?" Tommy nodded, a spark of confidence in his eyes. "Yeah, I can read. Helps me keep my edge." I liked that about him. The kid had a brain on his shoulders, and he knew how to use it. As we walked, I let my gaze wander over the cityscape, my mind drifting back to when I was his age. I'd been no different. Just another kid trying to survive in a city that didn't care whether you lived or died. My childhood had been spent dodging trouble, running messages for anyone who'd toss me a coin. The streets were my school, teaching me how to read people, how to blend in, and most importantly, how to stay alive. When I was 17, I'd had enough of the streets. The army was my ticket out, a chance to be something more than just another forgotten face. I'd signed up the first chance I got, leaving behind the only life I'd ever known. I still remember the day I left, standing on the platform at Union Station, the train's whistle blowing as I said my goodbyes to a city that had both raised me and scarred me. "Paper says you're from here," Tommy said, interrupting my thoughts. "But you don't sound like it. You sound like one of them Brits." I chuckled softly, shaking my head. "Yeah, I get that a lot. When I was in the army, I worked as a codebreaker and interpreter. Seems I've got a good ear for accents. At first, I did it to blend in, but eventually, it just stuck, I guess." Tommy nodded, mulling that over. "Never met anyone like you before, Mr. Mason." "Just Max, remember?" I corrected, giving him a pat on the shoulder. "And I'm betting you've got plenty more questions, but let's focus on finding your friend first, yeah?" "Yeah, let's find Joey," Tommy agreed, his tone serious. We continued walking, the rail yard coming into view, a place of rusted tracks and forgotten freight. The closer we got, the more I could feel Tommy tense up, his steps becoming more cautious. This place was no playground, even for a kid as sharp as Tommy. It was a place where the city's underbelly came to life, where the shadows stretched long and deep, and where kids like Joey could disappear without a trace. As we approached, I felt a familiar sense of foreboding settle in. This case was going to be more complicated than it seemed, but I knew one thing for sure. Tommy Flynn was more than just another street kid, and maybe, just maybe, he'd prove to be as valuable to me as Holmes' irregulars had been to him. As we reached the edge of the rail yard, I slowed my pace, turning to Tommy with a pointed look. The kid had been on edge the entire walk, and I could tell there was more to this story than he was letting in. I needed to get to the truth, and I needed it now. "All right, Tommy," I said, my tone firm, but not unkind. "I need you to level with me. What were you and Joey really doing down here?" Tommy hesitated, his eyes darting around as if looking for an escape. He stuffed his hands into his pockets and stared at the ground. "I told you, Max, we were just hanging around, trying to stay out of trouble." I shook my head, stepping in closer. "Be honest with me, kid. If what you were doing was on the up and up, you'd have gone to the police, not come looking for me. Now, I'm not here to judge you, but I can't help you if you're not straight with me. So, what were you really up to?" Tommy chewed on his bottom lip, the silence stretching out between us. Finally, he let out a heavy sigh, his shoulders slumping. All right. We were looking for stuff to sell. You know, scrap metal, old tools, anything we could get a few bucks for. Joey had this idea to check out the old warehouses by the tracks, and I know the law wouldn't like us letting ourselves in there, but Joey said we might find something worth taking." I nodded, not surprised by the admission. Kids like Tommy and Joey did what they had to do to get by, even if it meant bending the law. "And did you find anything?" I asked, keeping my voice even. "Yeah," Tommy admitted, glancing up at me through his bangs. "We found a few things, but then we heard someone coming. Joey told me to hide, but he didn't come with me. That's the last I saw of him. I waited, but he never came back." I studied Tommy's face, seeing the fear and guilt written all over it. He was scared that whatever happened to Joey was his fault. But more than that, he was scared of what I think of him now that the truth was out. "All right, kid," I said, resting a hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing by telling me. Now let's figure out what happened to Joey." As the last light of day faded, the shadows in the rail yard grew long and deep, swallowing the twisted tracks and forgotten freight cars in a murky gloom. The air had a sharp bite to it, a reminder that summer had given way to fall, and with the setting sun, the temperature had dropped like a stone. Overhead, a crescent moon peeked through the thickening clouds, casting just enough light to outline the skeletal remains of the old warehouses and the rusted steel of the tracks. The yard was a desolate place, the kind that seemed to absorb sound, where even the distant hum of the city was muted. The only noise was the occasional clatter of a loose piece of metal in the wind, echoing through the empty spaces between the buildings. It was the kind of place where you could disappear, where secrets could be buried without a trace. Tommy walked beside me, his earlier bravado fading as the darkness closed in. He kept glancing over his shoulder, his steps quickening, as if he wanted to get this over with as fast as possible. "It's just up ahead," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the rustling of the leaves that skittered across the ground. I nodded, keeping my eyes sharp as we made our way deeper into the yard. The moonlight caught on the broken windows of the old warehouses, casting fractured patterns of light across the ground. The place felt abandoned, but I knew better than to trust appearances. There was always something hiding in the dark, waiting for those who weren't paying attention. We reached a spot where the tracks split, leading off into different directions, each one more overgrown and forgotten than the last. Tommy stopped, pointing to a cluster of rusted barrels and twisted scrap metal piled haphazardly against the side of a derelict building. "That's where I last saw him," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. I crouched down, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light as I scanned the area. The ground was uneven, a mix of gravel, dirt, and old oil stains. Most would see nothing but debris, but I'd learned to look past the obvious. I let my gaze travel slowly, taking in the smallest details. The way the gravel had been disturbed, the the faint outline of a shoe print partially obscured by the scattered metal shavings. There was something else too, something that caught the faint glint of moonlight. I moved closer, pushing aside a tangle of old wire to reveal a small, frayed piece of fabric caught on the edge of a jagged metal shard. It was dark, nearly black in the poor light, but it looked like it might have been part of a coat or a jacket, torn off in a struggle perhaps. I stood up, turning the fabric over in my hands. It wasn't much, but it was something, a thread to pull on, to see where it might lead. I pocketed the fabric and continued to search, my eyes narrowing as I caught sight of a small, almost imperceptible drag mark leading away from the barrels toward one of the warehouse doors. The mark was faint, easily missed, as if something or someone had been pulled away. "Tommy," I called softly, my voice cutting through the thickening night. "Did Joey have a coat? What colour was it?" The boy nodded, stepping closer to see what I'd found. "Yeah, he did. It was dark, like brown or black. That his coat." I held up the fabric, letting him get a good look at it. "Could be," I said, keeping my tone neutral, "but I'll need to check a few more things. Stay close and keep your eyes open." With Tommy at my side, I moved toward the warehouse door, the feeling of unease growing stronger. Whatever had happened here, it was clear that Joey hadn't just wandered off. He'd been taken, and now it was up to me to figure out who or what had dragged him into the darkness. The air around the warehouse was thick with the kind of silence that only comes when something has gone terribly wrong. I took a deep breath, letting the cold night air sharpen my senses as I examined the ground near the warehouse door. The faint drag marks I'd noticed earlier led right up to the door, where they abruptly stopped. I knelt down, running my fingers lightly over the dirt, feeling the slight indentations. 2 distinct sets of prints. The spacing was wide, suggesting that whoever made them was large and moving quickly. This wasn't the work of one man. There had been 2. I straightened up, glancing over at Tommy, who was watching me with wide, anxious eyes. 2 men, I said quietly, more to myself than to him. Joey wasn't alone when he left here. Tommy's face paled, his fear clearly etched in the lines of his young face. "What do you mean? Who took him?" I shook my head, my mind working through the possibilities. "I don't know yet, but it looks like Joey saw something he wasn't supposed to. Those men, they were doing something in that warehouse they didn't want anyone to know about." I moved toward the warehouse door, pushing it open with a soft creak. The interior was pitch black, the shadows deep and impenetrable. I reached into my pocket, pulling out a small flashlight and flicking it on. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing rows of old crates stacked haphazardly along the walls, covered in layers of dust and cobwebs. The place had been abandoned for years, but there were fresh marks in the dirt on the floor, scuff marks, like something heavy had been moved recently. I followed the marks with my flashlight, noticing the way they led to an open space near the back of the warehouse. The air smelled faintly of oil and something else, something acrid that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I crouched down, inspecting the floor more closely. There were traces of what looked like spilled liquid, leading from the center of the room to a corner where a large metal drum lay on its side. "Someone was working in here," I murmured, more pieces of the puzzle falling into place. They were using the warehouse to store something, probably something illegal. I turned to Tommy, who was standing just inside the door, his hands clenched into fists. "Joey must have overheard something," I said, standing up. "Maybe he saw them moving something into that drum, or maybe he heard them talking. Either way, he got caught, and they couldn't risk leaving him here. 2 men. They dragged him out of here, probably looking for a place to stash him." Tommy's eyes were wide with fear. "Where'd they take him?" Tommy's question hung in the air, thick with desperation. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I turned back to the warehouse, letting my eyes scan the surroundings, my mind working through the possibilities. The faint odor that lingered in the air nagged at me, a sharp scent that didn't belong in an abandoned space like this. I crouched down, taking another whiff of the air. Something acrid and pungent, almost like alcohol. Bootleggers, I muttered aloud, the word cutting through the silence. Tommy's eyes widened. Bootleggers? You mean like... Yeah, I interrupted, the pieces beginning to fall into place. They were using this place to stash alcohol. They wouldn't want anyone, especially the cops, sniffing around here. Tommy pressed. So why not just kill Joey on the spot? Exactly, I said, pacing back and forth, trying to put myself in their shoes. They can't risk him talking, but killing him here might attract too much attention. They'd need to get him out of the city first, somewhere they can deal with him quietly. My thoughts raced, every possibility flashing through my mind, and then it hit me. A sudden, sharp realization that made my heart skip a beat. I stopped pacing, turning sharply to Tommy. I've got it! Tommy looked up at me, hope and fear battling in his eyes. What? What is it? They want to get him out of here without being seen. The easiest way to do that is to stick him in a train car. They wait for the train to leave the yard, and once they're far enough out, they do what they came to do. As if on cue, a train whistle echoed through the night, a low, mournful sound that sent a shiver down my spine. I snapped my head in the direction of the tracks, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. Damn it, I swore under my breath. It's about to leave. We haven't got much time. Tommy's face paled, the colour draining from his cheeks as he realized what that meant. We gotta stop it, Max. We gotta get Joey out of there before it's too late. Right, I said, my voice steely with determination. Come on, if we're lucky, we can still catch it. Without wasting another second, I grabbed Tommy by the arm, and we took off at a run, the gravel crunching under our feet as we made our way to the tracks. The train was already beginning to move, the heavy wheels clattering to life as it slowly picked up speed. My mind raced alongside the train, every second counting down as we sprinted toward the cars. I had no idea which one Joey was in, but I couldn't let that stop me. We'd find him, had to find him, before it was too late. As we reached the first of the moving cars, I grabbed hold of the metal ladder, pulling myself up with one hand and reaching back for Tommy with the other. Hold on tight, kid. We're not letting them get away with this. Tommy scrambled up beside me, his breath coming in short, terrified gasps, but his grip was firm. Together, we clung to the side of the train as it chugged its way out of the yard, the city lights slowly receding behind us. The train wasn't moving fast yet, but it wouldn't be long before it reached full speed. I needed to figure out which car Joey was in, and fast. I pulled myself up onto the narrow ledge, inching my way toward the nearest door, Tommy right behind me. The wind whipped at us, the noise of the train growing louder with every second. My heart pounded in my chest, the tension coiling tighter with each passing moment. Finally, I reached the door, yanking it open with a hard pull. Inside, the car was dark and filled with crates, likely the bootlegger's stash, but there was no sign of Joey. Not this one, I muttered, my frustration growing. We'll find him, Tommy urged, his voice shaky but determined. We have to. We moved to the next car, repeating the process, each moment feeling like an eternity. The train was gaining speed now, and the city was falling away, replaced by the open, desolate landscape outside of Chicago. As I opened the third door, a sudden sound reached my ears. A faint, muffled cry, barely audible over the roar of the train. I froze, listening intently. There it was again, a desperate, pleading sound, coming from deeper inside the car. "Joey!" Tommy yelled, his voice cracking with emotion. "Stay close," I ordered, slipping into the car and moving toward the source of the sound. My pulse thundered in my ears as I made my way past the stacks of crates. And then, finally, I saw him. Joey, bound and gagged, lying on the floor between two large crates, his eyes wide with fear but alive. "We've got you, kid," I said, rushing to his side and cutting the ropes that bound him. "You're gonna be all right. We're getting you out of here." Joey nodded. tears welling up in his eyes as Tommy knelt beside him, his own fear melting into relief. We didn't have much time, but we had what we came for. Now we just had to figure out how to get off this train alive. As I cut through the last of the ropes binding Joey, I heard the unmistakable creak of the train car door sliding open behind us. I spun around, my heart pounding as two figures stepped into the dim light cast by the swaying oil lamp above. One was a wiry, rat-faced man with a nasty grin, while the other was a hulking brute of a man, his shoulders broad enough to block out the light from the doorway. "Well, well," the skinny one sneered, his voice dripping with malice. "Looks like we got ourselves a couple of stowaways, Big Jack." The big man, who I could only assume was Big Jack, cracked his knuckles menacingly, his expression one of grim determination. "Looks like it," he rumbled, his voice deep and gravelly. "Too bad for them." I could feel Joey trembling beside me, and I knew we were out of options. My hand instinctively went to the revolver holstered at my side, but the thought of pulling the trigger made my stomach turn. The war had left its mark on me in more ways than one, and taking a life, even in self-defense, was something I'd sworn never to do again. But these men were closing in fast, and I knew they wouldn't hesitate to kill us if it came to that. My mind raced, searching for a way out, a way to stop them without crossing that line. That's when I saw it. One of the crates, slightly ajar, with a familiar scent wafting from it. The bootlegger's stash. My eyes flicked up to the oil lamp swinging precariously above, its flame casting flickering shadows across the car. An idea formed, desperate and dangerous, but it was all I had. "Tommy, get Joey out of here, now!" I barked, pulling my revolver from its holster. "But Max," Tommy started, his voice shaking with fear. "Now," I snapped, not taking my eyes off the two men, who were now only a few steps away. Tommy nodded, grabbing Joey's arm and pulling him toward the door at the other end of the car. I raised the revolver, aiming it not at the men, but at the crate of alcohol. With a deep breath, I squeezed the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the car, the bullet tearing through the wooden crate. Almost immediately, the pungent smell of alcohol filled the air, but there was no time to dwell on it. I shifted my aim upward, targeting the oil lamp swaying above. Another shot rang out, and this time the lamp shattered, sending flaming oil splashing down onto the crate. The effect was instantaneous. A small fireball erupted from the shattered crate, the alcohol igniting in a brilliant flash of light and heat. The two men recoiled, blinded and stunned by the sudden explosion. Big Jack roared in pain as the flames licked at his clothes, while the skinny one stumbled back, hands raised to shield his eyes from the blinding light. "Move!" I shouted, grabbing the boys and shoving them toward the open door. The flames were spreading fast, and the heat was already becoming unbearable, but the fire had done its job, buying us precious seconds to make our escape. We reached the door just as the fire began to consume the car, the crackling of burning wood and the hissing of vaporized alcohol filling the air. I didn't waste a second, leaping out of the car and onto the gravel below, pulling Joey and Tommy with me. We hit the ground hard, rolling to a stop as the train continued on, the burning car trailing smoke and flames behind it. I struggled to my feet, pulling the boys up with me, my heart pounding with a mix of adrenaline and relief. "Keep moving!" I urged them, not daring to look back as we scrambled away from the tracks and into the safety of the night. As we ran, the realization of what had just happened began to sink in. I'd managed to keep my promise to myself, but only just. The fire had given us our escape, but it was a reminder that sometimes the line between right and wrong wasn't as clear as I wanted it to be. That was a problem for another day. For now, we were alive, and Joey was safe. That was all that mattered. The evening air was cool as we made our way back to my building, the city's shadows stretching long and deep under the flickering streetlights. The boys walked quietly beside me, their steps heavier now, weighed down by exhaustion and the adrenaline that was finally wearing off. It had been a long day, and though they had narrowly escaped, I knew the night was far from over. We approached the entrance to my building, and I could see a faint light flickering from the hallway. As I opened the door and headed up the narrow staircase to my office, the scent of something warm and inviting drifted toward us. Bread, maybe soup too. Ellie had been here. Sure enough, sitting just outside my door was a large basket, covered with a cloth to keep the heat in. It was still warm, and I couldn't help but smile. Ellie must have been watching, waiting for us to return, but she had the good sense not to linger. She understood that the boys were skittish, especially now. I appreciated her intuition more than I could say. "Looks like Mrs. Watkins has been busy," I remarked, bending down to pick up the basket. "You two are in for a treat. She's quite the cook." Tommy's eyes widened with surprise, while Joey, the younger of the two, remained silent, eyeing the basket warily. He was a little shorter than Tommy, with a mop of dark hair that fell into his eyes and a scowl that seemed permanently etched on his face. Where Tommy was cautious and measured, Joey was all sharp edges and mistrust, a kid who'd learned to keep his guard up at all costs. I unlocked the door and pushed it open, revealing the small space that served as both my office and apartment. The office took up most of the room, dominated by a sturdy desk covered in papers, a worn leather chair, and shelves lined with books and old case files from my time with Holmes. To one side was a small sitting area where a threadbare sofa faced a fireplace that had long since gone cold. A door to the right led to a cramped bathroom, and another door at the back opened into my living quarters, a modest bedroom and kitchen separated by a thin wall. The place was functional, even cozy in its own way, but it was a far cry from the cottage Holmes and I had shared in the English countryside. That cottage had been a refuge, a quiet, peaceful place tucked away from the world, where the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant call of birds. The rooms had been filled with the scent of old books, pipe tobacco, and the faint smell of the herbs Holmes kept for his experiments. It was a place where I'd found solace in the last years of his life, even as his health declined and the man I'd known began to fade away. Here, in Chicago, there were no such comforts. The city was loud, dirty, and restless, and the walls of this place seemed to absorb that energy, reflecting it back in the form of creaking floorboards and drafts that seeped through the cracks in the windows. But it was home now, and I was determined to make it work. I set the basket down on the desk and motioned for the boys to sit. "Make yourselves comfortable," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "There's a bathroom through that door if you need to clean up, and once you've had a bite to eat, we'll talk." Tommy nodded, moving toward the bathroom without a word, while Joey lingered by the desk, eyeing me suspiciously. He was thinner than I'd expected, his clothes hanging off him like they'd been borrowed from someone bigger. His hands were dirty, his nails bitten down to the quick, and there was a hardness in his eyes that didn't belong in someone so young. "You all right, Joey?" I asked, trying to catch his gaze. He shrugged, finally meeting my eyes. "Why do you care? You're just going to ask a bunch of questions, like all the others." I leaned against the desk, crossing my arms. "Maybe, but I'm also the one who got you off that train, and I'm the one who can help make sure those men don't come after you again." He narrowed his eyes, as if trying to figure out what my angle was. "You think you're so smart, don't you? Just because you're some big-shot detective." "I don't think I'm smart," I said calmly. "I am smart. But it doesn't take intelligence to know when a kid's been through something tough. You don't have to trust me right away, but I promise you this. I'll do everything I can to help you and Tommy, but I need to know what happened." Joey glanced toward the bathroom, where the sound of running water could be heard. Then, as if making a decision, he moved to the sofa and sat down, his shoulders hunched, his eyes fixed on the floor. I gave him a moment, letting the silence stretch out, before I joined him. "All right," I said quietly. "Start from the beginning. Tell me everything you remember. Leave nothing out." Joey's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white against his dirty skin. We weren't doing anything wrong, you know? Just trying to find some stuff we could sell. Scrap metal, old tools, whatever we could get our hands on. We were careful, staying out of sight. But then we heard something. Voices. It sounded like an argument, so we hid. We didn't want any trouble, just wanted to wait until they were gone. His voice shook slightly, but he continued, his words tumbling out faster now. I told Tommy to hide, and I went to see what was going on. That's when I saw them, two guys loading something into a crate. It smelled funny, like chemicals or something. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't right. They were arguing about a shipment, something big, something they didn't want anyone to know about. I nodded, encouraging him to go on. One of them spotted me, Joey said, his voice barely a whisper now. He yelled, and they came after me. I ran, but they were fast. They caught me, tied me up, and dragged me to that train car. I thought they were going to kill me right there, but they started talking, said they couldn't do it here, too risky. So they shoved me in the car and said they'd take care of me once we were out of the city. He looked up at me then, his eyes shining with fear and anger. I didn't mean to get us in trouble. I just wanted to see what was going on. I didn't think they'd come after me like that. I placed a hand on his shoulder, offering what little comfort I could. You did the right thing by telling me, Joey. We're going to figure this out, but you need to trust me. Those men aren't going to get away with this. Joey nodded, though I could see the doubt lingering in his eyes. It was going to take more than words to earn his trust, but I was willing to do whatever it took. These kids had been through enough, and I wasn't about to let them down. As the night settled in and the city outside grew quiet, the three of us huddled in my small apartment, the warmth of Ellie's food easing some of the tension from the day. Joey, still shaken from his ordeal, eventually drifted off to sleep in the worn leather chair by the fire. His breathing was steady but shallow, and I could see the lines of worry etched into his young face, even in sleep. Tommy and I moved quietly, not wanting to disturb him. I grabbed a couple of blankets from the small closet in my bedroom and handed one to Tommy, who spread it over Joey, tucking it around his friend with a care that spoke volumes about their bond. We sat down at the table, the flickering light from the fireplace casting long shadows across the room. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the weight of what had happened hanging heavily between us. Finally, I broke the silence. Tommy, you and Joey need to lay low for a while. Those guys are going to be looking for him, and we can't risk them finding him. You've got to keep him out of sight. Tommy nodded, but his expression was grim. That's easier said than done, Max. Joey's, well, he's not the type to stay put. He's always got to be doing something, always pushing the limits. I figured as much, I said, rubbing the back of my neck. I'd let you both stay here, but this place is too small, and there's a steady stream of people coming in and out. It's only a matter of time before someone spots you. We've got places to lay low, Tommy replied, his voice low. No problem there. We've been on our own long enough to know where to hide when we need to. I studied Tommy for a moment, seeing the determination in his eyes. He was young, but there was a strength in him that I couldn't help but respect. Good. Just make sure you keep Joey out of sight. He's been through enough already, and I don't want to see him get hurt again. Tommy nodded, glancing over at his sleeping friend. I'll keep him safe, Max. I promise. Reaching into my pocket, I pulled out a few bills and held them out to Tommy. Take this. It's not much, but it'll help you get by for a while. Tommy hesitated, looking at the money as if it was something foreign. I don't need your money, Max. I already owe you. This isn't a handout, I said firmly. Consider it a retainer for future services. Tommy frowned, not quite understanding. What do you mean? I want you and your friends, the ones you trust the most, to be my eyes and ears on the street, I explained, keeping my voice low and steady. I'll pay you and them for any information you bring me. It won't make you rich, but it will keep food in your belly and clothes on your back, and it will give you a way to keep yourself safe. Tommy looked at me, a mix of surprise and skepticism in his eyes. You want us to work for you? I nodded. That's right. I need people who know the streets, who can blend in and pick up on things that others might miss. You and your friends are perfect for that. You help me, I help you. It's a fair deal. Tommy seemed to consider this for a moment, then slowly took the money from my hand. All right, Max, we'll do it. But just so you know, we're not doing this for the money. We're doing it because you helped us tonight. We won't forget that. I wouldn't expect anything less, I said with a small smile. Just remember to keep your heads down and stay out of trouble. Tommy nodded, his expression serious. We will, Max. Thanks. With that, we both fell silent, the weight of the night's events settling in. Joey shifted in his sleep, murmuring something unintelligible, and I could see the worry in Tommy's eyes as he watched his friend. It was clear that they'd been through more than their fair share of hardships, but they had each other, and now they had me. For the first time since I'd returned to Chicago, I felt like I was starting to build something here. It wasn't much, just a couple of street kids and a few leads, but it was a start, and in a city like this, sometimes a start was all you needed. Thank you for tuning in to part 1 of Sherlock's Apprentice. Will Max uncover the bootleggers' scheme before they track down the boys? Will Ellie reveal her secret in time to seek help? Has Max stumbled into a case that even his wits can't solve? Join us next time for part 2 of Sherlock's Apprentice to find out the answers to these questions and more. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to follow along on this thrilling journey. Until then, keep your ears sharp and your wits sharper.